Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today we're going to talk about the stretch shortening cycle and throwing velocity. All right. So what is the stretch shortening cycle? So it's a rapid eccentric action followed by the amortization phase, right, which is isometric, followed by kind of the rapid concentric phase. And so what it does essentially, it allows energy to be stored and utilized, and this kind of enhances the output of movements. So, essentially a rapid stretch occurs. The muscle spindles, which sense both kind of magnitude and velocity of stretch, are like, oh man, they turn on, they send a signal for the muscle to contract faster and more forcefully than it could volitionally, all right? So we get this kind of, higher output than we would otherwise be able to do. So first, throwing is a plyometric activity, right? And overhead throwing is the fastest movement in sports with internal rotation angular velocities up to 7,000 degrees per second. So in order for arm action to lead to the highest possible velocity, throwers must be elite at storing and releasing elastic energy in the upper body, okay? So I think that's really important to know. So during layback, for example, the internal rotators are pre-stretched, right? And they're launched into internal rotation during arm acceleration. In order to be able to do this at the highest possible level, we should make sure that the body is adequately prepared. So this is kind of get into how we kind of train guys, all right? And so the same is true for horizontal abduction, retraction, hip shoulder separation, all of these things. We're getting kind of this big stretch and then we're getting this big return kind of after the fact, all right? And so essentially the really big ones that we're gonna look at, hip shoulder separation, right? Retraction, horizontal abduction, so kind of lagging the arm, and then layback. These are kind of the big three that we'd really be digging into here when it comes to the relevance of the stretch shortening cycle. And so, right, I think one of the things is we've had a muscle-driven focus for a long time. And strength matters, but kind of solely concentric strength has been a large part of the equation for too long. All right, and so I think, big deadlift numbers are great, right? All of these things are really good, and it's important, especially if we have really, kind of weak athletes who are beginners, all these, focusing primarily on concentric improvements, like they would get better doing whatever. So if they get stronger, totally fine. And again, strength is an important piece. We need this baseline, but it is far from the only thing. And so if we push concentric strength for forever, we're not going to continue to have the same impact. And so there's a couple of pieces here. So one is that beyond a certain level, we're not going to affect this really, really fast movement with these slow, heavy things, right? That's kind of one thing. The second is, beyond a certain level, the amount of kind of training time, effort, all of these resources that it's going to take to push these strength numbers up is not going to be worth our time, and our time would be better spent somewhere else. So I think that's kind of an important thing as well. So, there's a disregard for the connective tissue, such as fascia and tendons. And so what you need is a mix of both kind of compliant and stiff connective tissue. So if we think about what a tendon does, right, it connects muscle to bone, right? Or if you want to think about it a little bit kind of more meta, it's a continuation of muscle that kind of eventually kind of goes to the bone. But what's kind of happening is we need to connect a pretty compliant thing, the muscle, to a very stiff thing, bone. That's a pretty hard job. So we can't have it be too stiff or we get muscle pulls. We can't have it be too compliant or we're not going to get a good transfer of energy, right? Now, whereas ligaments are also connective tissue, but they connect bone to bone. We want them to be as stiff as possible because they're connecting two stiff things. And so if you want to see a really good example of what happens if you have too compliant of a ligament, look at women's sports, especially soccer and lacrosse, where we see a ton of ACL tears, and especially repeat ACL tears in women. And so what happens is, because of kind of their hormonal profile, they have more compliant ligaments. And so they tend to get more injuries to that because it can't support the nature of what they're doing in those sports to some degree. So that's kind of an important thing to think about when we talk about kind of this spectrum of compliant to stiff. We need a mix, right, for our tendons, fascia, that kind of stuff. It can't just be as stiff as possible. It needs to be kind of a mix of both. There's some nuance there. And that's going to be a little bit different for each guy, but more homogeneous within the demands of the same sport. And so, what we need is the tendon has to be able to absorb impacts. This is where the kind of the compliance comes in. And then it also needs to be able to kind of act like a spring and drive output. And this is where the stiffness comes in. And so isometric and eccentric actions have an important role to play here, right? Because we have this really fast, kind of forceful eccentric happening, followed by this isometric, which needs to be like hitting a brick wall. and then we had this kind of rebound into a concentric. So we need a really efficient kind of transfer. We need really efficient connective tissue here. And so concentric strength has some transfer to throwing velocity, but again, beyond a given baseline, there's not a ton. And so eccentric RFD seems to be one of the primary separators in the fastest athletes in the world from their kind of less fast counterparts, right? So kind of how they develop force is an important piece. What kind of the signature that you see when you get them on force plates, that kind of stuff, that's all really important. So eccentric rate of force development is one of the really important factors here. And so the better athletes, they're able to deal with these high eccentric forces, and the faster they're able to load the tissue, the greater return they can get from this, right? We talked about how muscle spindles are sensing both magnitude and velocity of the stretch. So if we can make that stretch really, really fast, we're likely to get a better return from this as well. And so, this is one of the reasons that eccentrics and isometrics are so important. They must be trained, as well as just the concentric only movement. So the eccentric or loading phase is kind of followed by the amortization or transition phase, and the propulsive or concentric kind of comes after this. So if there's any gaps in any of these phases, energy is going to be lost as heat. So kind of getting into it now, how do we go about training these qualities? So I think there's a couple of ways. So we'll kind of go through this in the order of kind of how we would see this as a progression to some degree, but it wouldn't always happen in this exact order. So yielding isos. So these are also kind of like, they can be called super slow eccentrics as well. But what's kind of happening is this would be like kind of tendon prep, as well as muscle prep to some degree. But yielding isos would be kind of the first place we would go. Then we would go to overcoming isos. So you can put out huge forces at really specific joint angles. So this is really, really helpful for building strength in really specific ways where a dynamic movement isn't going to do super well because you're going to be really strong at these other places and pretty weak at this one specific spot. And that's going to determine how much load you can use. Whereas we can just load preferentially this one specific spot and take care of that, with this really specific shot. So then kind of another one we'd have is oscillatory isometrics. So this can be, I've talked about this in the past, but this can be a really solid transition from like the isometric stuff into kind of getting into plyometrics. So what you're going to see is kind of this repeated transition, eccentric, iso, concentric kind of thing, where we're kind of bouncing through these positions. And again, you can be preferential with where you do this. So if you have a problematic spot where we can't transition out of this, so if we think about this like a squat and you're failing at the bottom every single time, we can preferentially train that with like an oscillatory squat, for example. We can just oscillate through those couple of inches. We can do the same with any number of problematic points, whether it's during the throw or something else. All right, so then kind of next we'd have fast eccentrics, reflexive eccentrics. So reflexive eccentrics are Stuart McMillan, Matt Jordan stuff that they've kind of solidified to some degree. And so essentially we can go a couple of different ways with this. So fast eccentrics, we can do drops and things like that where we stick the landing. Reflexive eccentrics, we can load these things to some degree. Generally, it's a low percentage of our 1 rep max in a given movement. And same deal, we're going to hit it, we're going to stop it. And you can even do kind of a bounce out of some of these things, because we want to reverse this abruptly to kind of train this movement. So, and then kind of the next thing will be plyometrics. So we want to work through a variety of ranges and intensities. We're going to work from extensive to intensive. And again, these shallow ranges where we're bouncing, these kind of medium ranges, and kind of these deep ranges. So Matt Watson has a really good kind of system for this with his kind of how he views the various types of plyometrics and kind of the ranges of motion, all these other things that he would work through. And so kind of the same thing happening here in terms of how we're looking at kind of training these guys. So, again, we don't want to devalue strength. That's a really important piece, and it's something we train hard here as well. But beyond a certain level, if you squat 500 pounds, we need to take you to 550 for you to throw 95? No, probably not. We need to train these other qualities, and it's not worth our kind of valuable training resources to put all of our effort towards that when there's likely other things that could be worked on instead. So this is just something, this is kind of how the stretch shortening cycle plays into throwing velocity. Just wanted to kind of talk about this a little bit. We can go deeper into some of the training methodology down the line, but this is kind of our jumping off point. If you've got questions, feel free to drop them below. But otherwise, thanks for watching. See you in the next video.